Hey, this is Jim Katsoulis, and I want to talk about a book I just finished reading. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he was a psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist back in Nazi Germany, and he was put into a concentration camp and lived there for years. And it's a really, really interesting take because, again, I think a lot of us have heard concentration stories at this point, but to see it from the perspective of a psychiatrist is very interesting because he goes into it with a certain point of view. And so some of the, the takes he has on it and some of the insights are pretty valuable. And he ultimately came out with a theory called Logotherapy, which I'll talk about in a moment. I think the big takeaway from this book, and again, it's the reason why I reread it every few years, is that regardless of the situation, no matter how bad the situation gets, we always have the ability to decide what our attitude is going to be. And I think a lot of times we hear this, especially when it comes to a lot of motivation type people. They seem very successful, seem like things are going well, and they'll tell us this, and we hear this. And again, it's true, but I think of this gentleman probably weekly as a reference point for perspective to realize that if he could say that, having lived through pretty much the worst thing you can possibly live through, and he saw literally this in action, again, in these concentration camps, if it can happen in those situations, then really there is no excuse for me in the life that I lead to not really manage my attitude, especially when things seem difficult, when things are hard. So I want to share it in his exact words. This is a quote I wrote down. He said that everything can be taken except one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And so again, even in this situation, and so, majority of this book is his experiences in the concentration camp and what he went through. And again, it's the worst stuff you can just imagine. It's so inhumane and so inhuman. It's horrible. And yet, even in this situation, there were people that would give up their literally crumbs, of food for other people to help other people. So it was always, even in this situation, people had the ability, some of them anyways, to be able to direct their attitude in a certain direction. And so the theory he came out with was logotherapy. And basically what this comes down to, he noticed within these camps that the one thing that seemed to sustain people, and it seemed to be literally the decider between whether people were able to continue or whether they gave up and died, was if they had some meaning in their life, some meaning to their life. And so it could be someone that they wanted to see. They wanted to get out of the concentration camps and see a child or a wife or a family member. And so that gave them the meaning to keep going. It could be something with work. Maybe they wanted to write a book or produce some music when they got out. And so that became the meaning that gave them the courage and the ability to keep moving forward. And so he found this to be kind of the primary really kind of push of our lives. And even, I found this interesting, he writes down that, he says, and again, this is the logotherapy again, but the basic tenet of logotherapy is that man's main concern is not to gain pleasure or to avoid pain, but rather to see a meaning in his life. And so this became kind of the core of his philosophy when he got out of there, and when he worked with people that were suicidal or clinically depressed. Well, again, what he found and noticed, just like in the camps, is that the people that had no meaning to their lives, this was almost the worst thing that could happen, literally, than the actual starvation, the beatings, the cold, and all the horrible things that were happening physically. The worst thing that could happen ultimately was when they lost any sense of meaning in their lives. And so he would work with people to help them find that meaning as a primary form of therapy. So he basically broke it down into three ways. He said we can discover the meaning of life in three ways. The first one was by doing a deed, okay, and so I think that's self-explanatory. The next one was by experiencing a value. Now this could be by experiencing love from another person, by experiencing you could hear some music that lifted you up to another, really moved you. And so again, that could give you meaning. And then finally, by suffering. And he said a lot of times suffering would be the final chance for a lot of people to really get some meaning out of their lives. And literally, he says it's about the suffering, that suffering ceases to be suffering in some way at the moment it finds a meaning. Okay, and so when people can find their suffering or experience their suffering as having meaning, it can change it. He talks about an example in there of a gentleman whose wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and he was just been depressed since it had happened. And so he asked him, you know, what would have happened if you had passed away first? How would it be for your wife? And he said, oh, it would have been absolutely torture for my wife. And so he said, well, maybe you are here because you're meant to take that burden on for her. Okay? And again, whether this is true or not, you know, it is irrelevant to the point that as soon as this person accepted that there was some meaning to their suffering and them still being alive while their wife had gone, then they could the suffering eased up a little bit because all of a sudden it had some meaning to it. And I thought this was kind of interesting. So again, I mean, I think the practicalness of this, I think, is to reflect again on what is the meaning of your life. What is important to you? You know what I mean? Why you do what you do. One other point I want to make too, he would say that there's no general definition of what the meaning of life is, right? He uses the comparison of, he says, you know, if you ask a chess master, what's the best move? There is no one best move. There is no one answer to what's the meaning of life. He would say that it depends on moment to moment. You know, it changes moment to moment on the situation and where we're at. So I find that helpful because sometimes we try and make this one thing that's going to apply to all situations at all times. And I've never been able to do it. And he kind of gave me permission in a sense to, well, that's not really what we're looking for. So again, it's moment to moment. And in the moment, again, when you take the attitude that you bring into the situations, the person you want to be, day in and day out, situation to situation. And again, it's up for you and each of us to decide what our meaning is going to be. But again, it just gives you some guidelines of how to do that. Now, one last thing I want to touch on. This is, you know, in a way, it was kind of left field in a sense in this book, but I found it very interesting. He calls this, there's a thing called paradoxical intention. And so I wanted to share, I like to try and share at least a couple things that are really practical. And I know this is practical because I used to do this when I was a kid. I used to have nightmares. And one of the things I started doing, and I don't know how I got the idea to do this, but I started, as I was about to fall asleep, I'd be lying in bed getting ready to go to sleep, and I'd be thinking to myself, I hope I have a nightmare tonight. I'm going to have a nightmare. I want to have a nightmare. And I would think about the nightmares that I'd had. And what would happen is I stopped having nightmares. And so I found this really interesting. Again, at the end of the book, he talks about this, and I don't know if he coined this term or not, but it's the first time I've heard it, you know, in a book like this taught. But it's called Paradoxical Intention. So basically what it means is when you have an obsession or a problem, and instead of always trying to avoid it or stop it, you kind of go fully into it and you almost flip the script on it. So he uses an example of a doctor he worked with who had a sweating issue, and he sweated a lot. And so one of the things he started doing is he would say, and this specifically was when he was meeting you know, other colleagues, and I guess he felt insecure about it. So he would say to himself, you know, last time I met this other doctor, I sweated, you know, a cup of, you know, it was a cup of moisture. And this time when I do it, I want it to be like a liter of moisture. I want to try and sweat even more. So again, it's that opposite way of approaching it. And without going into too much detail, he doesn't go into too much detail about it, to be honest. But I know it works. And I still do it to this day. And I learned it just as a kid, I don't know how. And so he went through a few more scenarios and examples of how this works and when it's worked. But again, just as a practical thing here, the two takeaways that I would suggest, kind of wrapping it up. The first one is, again, to be clear on some of the bigger meanings of your life, you know, how you define yourself and what some of your bigger meanings that you're looking to accomplish in your life are. And then kind of bring that into the micro as well. Even right now, in the situations that you're in day to day, hour to hour, who do you want to be, right? What is the meaning of the things you're doing on a regular basis? And I think that does bring a certain sense of peace and a certain sense of contentment to yourself, you know, when you think in that way. And then the paradoxical intention is anything you've been struggling with, play around with approaching it the opposite way. You know, so again, if you're anxious, right, ask yourself, can I get even more anxious about this thing? Right. And again, it's just a way to just flip it up a little bit, because sometimes we obsess so much. And I wrote he wrote this about paradoxical intention. Once a patient stops fighting his obsessions and instead tries to ridicule them by dealing with them in an ironical way, the vicious cycle stops. Okay? And I have found this to be true. But so again, it's just something, check it out, try it out, you know. It may help you, and if it does, so, you know, super. So again, thanks lots for watching this. Again, the book, Man's Search for Meaning, is a quick read, really, really good book. And thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next one.